Hello, my name is Kaze and welcome to another Right Brain tutorial. So in this tutorial I want to talk a little bit about Blender and geometry nodes. Unless you've been living under a rock, you might have heard that Blender got geometry nodes, which are analogous to what we've been able to do in Houdini all along, which is to use nodes to alter geometry. This is a really cool development. I've been spending a lot more time in Blender. I find it to be a really exciting and fresh application. Now, I do want to say that we're still in the early days of this development. They just were released with the Blender production build 2.92, and there's an upcoming production build 2.93, which should be coming out in about a month and a half, which adds even more power to the geometry nodes. So this is really cool, but as I said, I want to warn that we're still in the early days for Blender geometry nodes. Nonetheless, I'm very excited about it, and apparently I'm not the only person to be excited, because even the Entagma guys have started doing some tutorials on geometry nodes. Alright, so here we are in Blender, and let's do something very simple, which is a good kind of test case scenario for showcasing what geometry nodes can do. We're going to create a terrain, and then we're going to scatter some rocks. Alright, so let's start by adding a plane. And I'm going to change the scale, maybe like 25 meters square, so it's a nice plot of land. And the first thing I want to do with this plane is I want to subdivide it. Let's add like a subdivision surface modifier. Let's go all the way up, keep it simple. I just want to add some geometry to this. I'm going to click apply. And I'm going to add another subdivision surface just to kind of have some additional geometry. And I think like 4 is probably fine. And then what I'm going to add is a displace modifier, because I want to create some displacement onto this plane. So let's create, I'm going to click on add a new texture, and the texture tab is right here. I'm just going to switch this from image to movie to something like clouds. Okay, so this is going to displace our geometry, and right now it's kind of like really crazy because the scale is really small, so I'm going to increase the scale size, say by 25. That might be a little too much. Let's go like 10. Okay, I mean that kind of feels a little bit terrain-like. I can go even a little bit smaller, like 8, and let's go back to my modifier window, and I'm just gonna increase the strength to, I don't know, say something like 2. Okay. So this is starting to kind of feel a little bit like, you know, like some sort of terrain somewhere. Okay, cool. Having said that, I'm going to go into object, and I'm just going to say that I want to convert to mesh. And all this is going to do is just going to apply these modifiers. I could do it by hand, but this is like one step. And you'll see when I click on this, these two guys disappear. Alright, so now what we want to do is we want to instance some objects on it. And I'm going to like hide this guy for a moment, and I'm just going to hit Shift A to instance some more mesh. And I want to say that I have like some special add-ons enabled that you might not necessarily see if you're using Blender, but you know, like those are all like kind of freely available. I think this is like kind of the extra mesh add-on for Blender, and it's kind of like a built-in rock generator. So I'm just going to say I want to generate some rocks. Let me zoom in a little bit here, and let's generate, I don't know, like 5 rocks. Okay, so now they're all like kind of clumped on top of one another. So I want to do a couple of things. First of all, I'm going to select all the rocks. I'm going to hit M because I want to move them all into the same collection. I'm just going to call this collection rocks. Okay, cool. So now all those rocks are living inside this collection. And the other thing I want to do is just move them out of the way. So G and X, and just kind of push them out, because I don't want to see them. Now we can re-enable my terrain, and now let's get on to geometry nodes in Blender and scattering some rocks on this terrain. So I'm going to lift this guy up so that we can kind of split the screen. I'm still getting used to like how to better utilize the screen space in Blender, and I'm not sure that this is the way to do it. Houdini, like the node layout is very vertical, which is kind of nice. So you can kind of keep, what I like to do is keep my viewport on the left side of the screen, and then on the right side of the screen I like to keep all of my nodes. In Blender they move horizontally, so maybe this makes a little bit more sense, but I don't know. So let's find out. So I'm going to highlight the plane. I'm going to switch this bottom viewer here from the 3D viewport. I'm going to go to Geometry Node Editor, which is like this new editor that now you can access. And right now there's no nodes because we have to actually create nodes. And the way that Blender deals with creating these geometry nodes is through an actual modifier. So we have the option of either clicking this new button right here, or we can click on the add modifier and click on geometry nodes, which are somewhere in here. Geometry nodes, there they are. So either this or hitting new will do the same thing. I'm just gonna hit new because it's easier. So as you can see, it just added this modifier on our ground. I'm just gonna change the name of this to ground just so that we can call it what it is. Okay, so here is the simplest setup of geometry nodes. We have an input, which is basically where this geometry is coming in, and an output, which is where the geometry is going out to the screen. So let's do something with this, and let's start with the most basic kind of Houdini function, which is to scatter a bunch of points onto the surface. And we can do that by hitting Command A to add, and I'm just going to go under points. And I am going to select point distribute, and I'm just going to pipe it right here, and all of a sudden you can see that our plane disappeared and it's been replaced by a bunch of points. I do want to say one thing, and I don't know if I'm necessarily going to touch on it on this particular tutorial, but I am using the alpha version of Blender 2.93, so some of the nodes that you might see or you might catch me seeing, especially here, might not exist yet in 2.92. I find 2.93 to be fairly stable, but you know, it's not even a beta, it's really an alpha at this point, so you know, tread lightly. Okay, so we have nodes, and now we want to be able to copy our rocks onto each point, okay? Just like we would in Houdini with scatter node to scatter a bunch of points on the surface of an object and then do a copy to points. So the way you do this in Blender is Command A, and once again we go to the point menu, and now we want to do a point instance. So instead of copy to points, we're instancing to points. Same difference. So I'm gonna put this in line, and everything disappears because we haven't told Blender what it is that we want to instance. So in this particular case, if I wanted to instance just one rock, I could just literally point it to, say, rock number 1, and we have a bunch of rocks instanced on our ground. But in this particular case, I actually kind of want to randomize between these different rocks, and I have like 5 of them right here. This is why I put the rocks into their own collection, because now I can select collection here, and when I click on collection, now it gives me the option of selecting my collection. So here's the collection, except it's doing something really, really weird. It's actually being scattered everywhere except on the ground plane where I want them. And this is really not what we want. We want to be able to basically randomize these different rocks and scatter them on our ground plane. So in order to do that, I just need to uncheck this whole collection checkbox right here. And the moment I do, now we are back in business. And now, as you can see, we have a bunch of different rocks scattered onto our geometry ground plane right here. So far, so good. So let's do something with these rocks like we would want to do in Houdini. So the first thing I want to do is, probably the rocks are a little big. So actually, before the point distribute, I'm going to create an attribute. And this is the same as creating like a p-scale attribute in Houdini. So in this particular case, I want to randomize my scale. And once again, I'm going to pipe this right here. And as the attribute name, I'm just going to call it scale. So the moment I do that, you'll see that my rocks now are randomly changing sizes. And they're going from a scale of 0 to a scale of 1. Okay, so the minimum is 0 and the maximum is 1. Let's say that 0 is probably not what I want, so let's maybe make it 0.1 as my smallest rock, and then my maximum, I don't know, like 1.2 maybe. Yeah, you can go even smaller actually. Let's do it 0.8. Okay, so this is going to be fine for my rocks. So the other issue that I am seeing here is that some of the rocks are intersecting. You can kind of see right here, for instance, and there's like several rocks that are just kind of like merging into each other. And, you know, this might not be like a terrible thing, especially for rocks, but maybe you're dealing with something else for your own project and you don't want the geometry to intersect. So the way to fix that is in the point distribute node, we can change this from being random to a poison disk. Such a weird name. And what poison disk does is it allows us to define a minimum boundary for the points so that we can make sure that the rocks are not actually intersecting with one another. So let's switch that to poison disk. And now nothing has changed because our minimum distance hasn't really changed. So what we can do is we can say, I want the minimum distance to be, I don't know, let's try 0.1. It's probably going to be too small. Let's try 1. Now it's too large. We don't have any intersection on the rocks, but we also don't have that many rocks anymore. So we can go, let's see, like 0.5. I'm just going to take a look here and see. I mean, I think 0.5 is going to do it. These two are a little bit close. These guys are a little bit close. Let's make it 0.55. Let's make it 0.6. No, we're still having some intersection. Let's make it 0.7. All right. I think 0.7 is probably safe enough. And we can also change the maximum distance as well. So in this particular case, it's set to 1, but we can set it to, say, 0.8 or honestly, whatever it is that you might want. So this is a good way of being able to spread your geometry across our ground plane and not have it intersect. Okay, so what else can we do with this particular layout? One of the things that I want to do is I actually don't want to see just the rocks. I want to see my ground plane as well. And granted, I could just kind of come here and just duplicate this guy and then it would kind of live as its own geometry. But Blender does give us an option to merge two different geometries together so that we can see them both in the viewport automatically. And the Blender equivalent of the merge nodes is this node called join geometry, and this is identical to the merge. So what I can do is I can go straight from my original geometry, which remember is our ground or displaced ground plane. I'm just going to go straight into this geometry, and now we'll see that our ground appears into our viewport so that everything is being combined by this join geometry. Okay, so far so good. What else can we do with these rocks if we want to scatter them a little bit more creatively and have a little bit more of an artistic direction on what it is that we can do? So let's see. I randomized the scale right here, but I can also randomize the scale again. And this time I can do it between having created the points and instancing the geometry. So let's do that. I'm going to do another attribute randomize. I'm going to put it in line. And right now the attribute randomize is set to replace or create. So if I leave it at that, what it's going to do, it's actually going to completely defeat this guy. It's going to ignore it. And instead it's going to create a whole set of scale values for each individual point. And I don't necessarily want to do that. I kind of like the, you know, what this guy is doing right here. I just want to be able to maybe, you know, alter it a little bit more. So I can change this to add. And what this is going to do now is that it's going to add a value, whatever value I have here, to this value right here, okay? And right now it's not doing anything because obviously it's we haven't set the attribute, so I can just set it to scale. And now it's adding a value of 1 from a minimum value of 0. And that might be a little bit too much. But I want to do something a little bit different with this particular attribute randomize node right here. So I don't necessarily want to scale the rocks and make them all equally larger or smaller. I just want to maybe just make them taller or shorter. So let's do that. So the first thing I want to do is I want to change the mode from float, which is only one value, to vector, which is going to be 3 different values. okay? We're still affecting the scale, but now we have the ability to change the X, Y, or Z scale, okay? And let me just kind of reset this to 0. So right now, this is having no effect. As a matter of fact, if I mute it, you can see that there's no change to our rocks. So let's say I want to flatten all the rocks, okay? I think like in Blender, it's like Z. Z is up, it's not Y up. So let's say that I want to flatten it to 0.5. I want them to be like half. So you'll see that actually they got taller right now. And the reason why is because I'm in add mode. So if I actually want to take away value from this particular node, all I have to do is just change this to subtract, and now they get all flatter, okay? So now this node is making the rocks from just this random scale right here to changing just the scale in the Z value, in the vertical value. So now they're getting a little bit flatter, which to me looks a little bit more natural. Maybe I might have gone a little bit too far. Let's go to 0.75 so that we're kind of splitting the difference. Okay, cool. So what else can we do to these rocks if we want to continue to art direct this a little bit more? Let me give myself a little bit more space here. Let's change maybe their position in space. So we can do that by doing another attribute randomize, okay? And with this attribute randomize, for instance, I can decide that I want them to levitate, okay? So in this particular case, I'm going to change this once more from float to vector because I want to have individual control over the X, Y, and Z axis. And instead of replace and create, I'm just going to say add, okay? And right now we haven't defined an attribute yet, so I'm going to change this to position, which you might have noticed that Blender gives us this drop-down menu whenever I click on this with all the attributes that are currently available that have been created for this geometry, and one of them, sure enough, is position. So if I click on position right now, everything goes up by 1, okay? So let's go 0, 0, 0. So now we're like kind of resetting this particular randomization. And now you'll see that if I increase our Z axis, once again, up and down in Blender, now our rocks are starting to kind of float up into the air or come back down. So this is really, really cool and a nice way of, once again, be able to art direct things a little bit better and to try to kind of alter how this random placement of objects is on your plane. So let's do one more thing, which I'm going to show you, and that is let's randomize the rotation. And you guessed it, what we need to do now is just give ourselves a little bit more space, put another attribute randomize node right here, not to be position or scale, but to be actual rotation. So if I do that, now all of my rocks are kind of being rotated randomly in different axes. The problem is that now some of them are kind of standing upright. I don't really like that. So once again, I want to be able to art direct very specifically which axis they're rotating on. So I'm going to change this from float to vector. And now I have a little bit more control over which axis to rotate. I'm going to say let's zero everything out. So right now we're back to square one. And now I want to be able to rotate them just on the Z-axis, okay? So they're kind of like moving this way and not necessarily this way or this way. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say maybe like do a negative 90 degree on the minimum side, and then on the maximum side I'm going to do like a positive 90 degrees. So now I have random rotation for my rocks. So this is basically a really, really cool thing that we've been able to accomplish fairly easily with geometry nodes. So here's another example of what I've been able to do with geometry nodes in Blender. I mean, I took some Kitpatch 3D post-apocalyptic derelict buildings, and once again, I just kind of spread them out on a plane. Very, very simple node layout, you know, distribute points, randomize, scale, rotation, and that's about it. And then I just added like a little bit of ambient fog just to give it like more of this kind of desolate vibe to the whole scene. Right, so here's another fun little experiment that I was working with, and in this particular case I just scattered a bunch of cubes. But what I wanted to do is I want to be able to scatter the cubes only in very specific areas of my grid right here. And what I did is I simply painted some vertex maps onto my grid, and then I told Blender only scatter points where the vertex map was painted. And this was a really, really simple thing to do and implement. And it comes in really, really handy, say if you're doing some landscapes and you only want maybe trees to grow in a particular spot, or maybe you want like clumps of rocks in a different spot and you don't want them like uniformly all over the place. So this is an easy way that you can art direct very specifically where you want your geometry to be instanced. All right, so here's a fun one. This is a slice of Swiss cheese that I've been able to create procedurally in Blender thanks to the help of a fellow Blender user by the name of James. He actually made a tutorial on how to do Swiss cheese in Blender using the geometry nodes, and I'm going to post a link to that in the description below as well. So as you can see, there's already a bunch of cool stuff that you can accomplish with these geometry nodes, even though they're really new. I mean, I think that they came out less than a month ago. Everybody's really excited about this development. There's a ton of video on YouTube, different tutorials. I'm going to post some links down below on the ones that are the most interesting, where people way smarter than I am are doing some really, really cool stuff with them. Development in Blender is happening very, very rapidly. As a matter of fact, they recently even implemented a geometry spreadsheet. I never used that in Houdini because I always kind of find it to be very intimidating, but if you're into geometry spreadsheets, guess what? Blender has it too now. So having said that, if you're interested in seeing what Blender can do, I would encourage you guys to check out the new geometry nodes in Blender, check out some of the other tutorials that I mentioned, and see a little bit how Blender can fit into your workflow. For me, I am still sticking with Houdini, but at the same time I'm starting to use Blender more and more, and I think that the two of them are very complementary and they provide a really, really great ecosystem for me to do my creative projects. So on that note, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.